Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear participants and viewers. Welcome to this session of Meezan lecture series. So, in this series, currently we are studying the one of the preludes to the book Meezan, which is authored by Ustaz Javed Ghamidi, which, of course, as you would know, is his understanding of religion. He has presented his view on religion and interpreted Islam and its contents in this book. And we have been covering various chapters of this book. So there are two preludes or preambles, we can say, to this book. One of them relates to the fundamental principles of understanding Islam, and the other one relates to the overall framework of Islam. So we've already finished the second of these, and we were halfway through almost in the regarding the first of these preambles. And so in this preamble, the principles of determining the Sunnah are the principles that we are going to start off with today. Earlier on, we have already gone through the principles of understanding the Quran, which are 10, and we have seen how important these principles are for every student of the Quran, how indispensable they are as far as comprehending the Quran is concerned. They range from certain linguistic aspects to the arrangement of the Quran, its historical background, the way the contents are arranged in the Quran, and of course the theme and subject matter of the Quran, amongst other things. So today, after finishing off with the principles of understanding the Quran in our previous sessions, we will start today with the principles of determining the Sunnah. So as we all know, and we've discussed this, that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the final source of religion on earth, and through him Islam or religion has been given to us through in two means. I would say one of them is the Quran, and the other one is the Sunnah. So, as far as the Sunnah is concerned, today we will look at the content that is going to be that is handed down to us through this all-important source of religion. However, more importantly, we will first find out what exactly constitutes the Sunnah and how we determine the Sunnah and how we can actually pinpoint the principles of determining the Sunnah, so that by applying these principles, we can virtually come up with a list of the Sunnahs. We've already seen earlier on how this list has been compiled by Ustaz Javed Ghamidi, but of course that was something of a inference that he has made, and now come the detail of how that inference was made and how the list of the Sunnah that he had given earlier on has been compiled, and what led him to this compilation, and how exactly these principles were formulated, and how they have been helpful in determining the Sunnah. So the first thing that we have to understand is the word Sunan is actually the plural of Sunnah, and we have known that in this section, some of the important areas that we have to understand the Quran have already been taken up. So as far as the Sunnah is concerned, Ustad Ghamidi says that there are 7 principles which are helpful in determining what exactly is the body and the content of the Sunnah is. And so we start off with the first of these principles. The first principle, of course, is something that is of fundamental importance. I'm going to read some important excerpts from Ustaz Ghamidi's book Meezan, so that it becomes clear that what exactly he means by these principles. So the first of these principles is only that thing can be regarded a sunnah which can be classified as religion by its nature and status. This means that it must belong to the categories of worship rituals, purification of the body, purification of edibles, and purification of morals. Because if all directives of religion are comprehensively enlisted, they will fall in these 4 categories. It's an absolutely important principle which Ustaz Ghamidi has delineated here, that whatever is to be classified as Sunnah, whatever is to be classified as the Sunnah, is something that has to be religion itself by nature and status, something which has to be classified as, by its nature and status to be religion. And what exactly is that? Ustaz Ghamidi says that there are 4 spheres, 4 categories which form the categories in which every content of religion falls. So we have worship rituals. We have a category in which directives are given regarding the purification of our physical body, like hygiene principles. We have the third category, which consists of a whole category of directives that relate to the purification of edibles, or what are the edibles that are allowed and disallowed. And finally, we have a fourth category, which relates to the purification of morals, which means every good moral principle or every good moral directive has to be adopted. So these are the four categories. In other words, whatever is to be classified as a sunnah must fall in either of these four contents, because these are the four contents which depict the nature and status of religion. Now, what also importantly is to be understood is that the Quran is absolutely clear that the prophets of God were sent to deliver his religion, and in their prophetic capacity, the ambit of their thoughts and deeds was only that of religion. In other words, what is understood to be implied here is their private lives, their personal tastes, the way they lived, their social milieu, in which, of course, they lived in a certain culture, their personal likes and dislikes, they do not fall in the ambit of the Sunnah. So, Ustaz Ghamidi says that in their prophetic capacities, of course, they had their own, and they had their own character, they had their own responsibility that they had to discharge. But remember, they were also human beings. So, Ibrahim ibn Azar, Musa ibn Imran, Isa ibn Maryam, Muhammad ibn Abdullah. So, in their human capacities, they were individuals who never asked obedience from their followers in this human capacity. All their demands were confined to their prophetic capacity. And what was given to them in this capacity was religion. And thus, it was only religion whose propagation they were liable to. And this has been actually referred to in the Quran in very, very explicit words. So the Quran says, شَرَعَ لَكُم مِّنَ الدِّينِ مَا وَصَّى بِهِ نُوحًا وَالَّذِي أَوْحَيْنَا إِلَيْكَ وَمَا وَصَّيْنَا بِهِ إِبْرَاهِيمَ وَمُوسَى وَعِيسَى أَنْ أَقِيمُوا الدِّينَ وَلَا تَتَفَرَّقُوا فِيهِ. He has enjoined on you the same religion which he enjoined on Noah, and which we have now revealed to you, O Prophet, and which we enjoined on Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, with the assertion, adhere to this religion in your lives and do not create any divisions in it. So, the fundamental thing that has to be understood is that they have to adhere to this religion. The prophets of God were meant to teach people this religion in their capacity as prophets of God. So, whatever they present in the form of religion as religion is something that is liable to be followed. So, we also know, I mean, just as a further explanation, that Prophet Muhammad, for example, peace be upon him, he used weapons like swords and arrows in wars. He traveled on camels. He wore a particular dress. He constructed mosques made out of the stems of palm trees. Some foods that he liked were customary in the Arab society. And of course, he also wore a particular attire which was in vogue in Arabia in his own times. But none of these things can be termed as Sunnah. Neither can any person of learning regard them to be Sunnah. And in fact, something very important which the Prophet himself is reported to have said is worthy of our attention. So the words he has said are, I'm also a human being. When I direct you about something which relates to your religion, take it from me. And when I express my own opinion about something which is outside this sphere, then my status in this regard is nothing more than that of a human being. I had conjectured about something. Do not hold me accountable for such things which are based on opinion and conjecture. However, if I say something on behalf of God, take it, because I will never forge a lie on God. You very well know about your worldly affairs. Antum a'lamu bi umur dunyakum. So, of course, this has a background, this narrative in which the Prophet had commented on the pollination of certain trees, and he said that, well, if this is not done, what will happen? And without the people weighing his opinion as a personal opinion, they actually did not do the needful, and because of the needful not being done, they never had fruit. So the Prophet, while commenting on this, has said that I have not been sent to tell you whether you should do pollination, or you should water the plants, or you should give them manure. All these things are already known to us in our human experience. And when I tell you something about anything that relates to that human sphere, I'm like a common human being. I'm going to speak out of my own experience. I'm going to convey my experience. And of course, my experience is based on the experience of my elders, which could be right and which could be wrong. So, therefore, if I say something to you in the capacity of a human being, I have to be weighed. My own opinion is something that must not be taken as final. And we know in this regard that one of the battles that were fought by the Prophet, in fact, it was the Battle of Badr, in which he had thought that he would ask the army to situate itself at a certain place. And when he decided for a particular place, one of his very famous companions, Habab ibn Munzir, he said that, well, Prophet, has your decision been made on the basis of your own experience and knowledge, or is it something that has been divinely told to you? The Prophet said, no, it's my own personal thought that I should have the whole army situated at this particular point. So Habab said, well, in my opinion, this is not a good vantage point and we will be vulnerable to the army, so it's better if we move from that place. This, of course, something that Prophet immediately accepted because, of course, it had a lot of weight in it. So clearly we see that the Prophet would at times change his opinion, his personal opinion. However, whenever he would be divinely guided, people would ask him and he would say that, yes, in this matter, I have been divinely guided, and therefore they would, of course, not argue in that sense. But in most cases, as we all know, in his human capacity, this is something that has to be understood, that his personal, for example, if he had a liking for olive oil, or maybe if he liked the white color, or if he had a certain fruit that he really liked a lot, or a certain dress, or if he wore a certain uh, turban, all these things in their own personal capacity, they never form a sunnah. And our celebrated scholars have actually condoned this and said that people who actually regard his personal likes and dislikes regarding worldly affairs to be part of the sunnah, they have faltered. This is not the correct way. The sunnah has to be something that at all cost must relate to religion. It has the status and nature of religion, and it should not be anything which is beyond it. So this is the first and perhaps the most important principle. The second principle, so the sunnah entirely relates to practical affairs of life.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Saleem. Are we having some technical issues?
The video comes, we can just open the section for any Q&A, any general Q&A that people might be having, so that...
Without further ado, Asim Awan, you're the first one in the queue. Please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. So Dr. Shehzad, I hope everything is well. So my question that pertains to this is, we know the incident of Hazrat Ishaq alayhi salam when he forbade camel meat for himself, and that became belief among the Bani Israel that this is something forbidden. So by analogy, we have like a lot of Muslims, they say things like, even though it's not required, it's something that's religiously, or I don't even know if it's religiously, it's something that you can gain blessings just by imitating, for example, the Prophet's dress or the type of sandals he wore and things like that. Is it even incorrect? Because based upon my understanding, it seems like it would be even like incorrect or even an innovation to say something like that. Oh, well, you can gain some blessing because the Prophet wore this type of clothes, so I'm going to wear this type of clothes. Can you just give some input into that
Yes,
idea?
A small correction. The provisions of the camel was actually done by Jacob, the father of Joseph, not by Isaac actually. So it was Jacob who forbade the camel on himself, and that was mostly as a personal inclination. And as a result, the rest of the followers or people who came after him, they actually followed suit, and they thought that, well, this personal choice is also as important as any forbiddance or allowance in religion. And as a result, for a very long time, camel meat was forbidden to the Israelites, not because God had done so, but because they chose themselves to do so. So as far as this behavior is concerned, it is precisely to circumvent this behavior that in the last the prophethood, the last messengers, he made it very clear. If you recall the quotation that I was just referring to earlier on a while ago, it says, "Antum a'lamu bi umur dunyakum," that you are more conversant with the affairs of life. And then he said, "Innama ana bashar," إِذَا أَمَرْتُكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِّن دِينِكُمْ فَخُذُوهُ بِهِ, which means that if I say something to you which is in line with religion or which is from religion, then you are bound to follow me. But if I say something which is outside the scope of religion, then you are not required to follow me. So he has made it clear himself. So I think this is a very big misconception that has arisen in our, I would say, a lot of people who take his personal habits as his personal choices to be something that are equally, I would say, rewarding. They think that if they imitate the Prophet or they do what the Prophet did, then maybe it is something that's going to win them more favor with God. So the Quran has expressly negated this, and the Prophet himself has said that I am to be followed as a prophet of God, not as someone who is going to do something in his personal life. So therefore, I mean, people who do so, I think they need to revisit their argument, and the Quran and the Sunnah and Hadith themselves are totally, they say something is totally opposite.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem. For follow-up questions, you can raise your hand again. Ahmed, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Saab. My question is about face covering. To my understanding, face covering or veil is discouraged in Hajj and Namaz. So should we infer from this that face covering is overall discouraged in Islam, which is quite the contrary of general belief that this is something which is appreciated? So should we understand that in Islam, this was actually discouraged? So can you please shed light on that?
So
Thank
you see,
you.
made it explicitly clear that there's no concept of covering your face with a veil. The directive that has been the source of this misconception is found in Surah Al-Azab. That was not at all a directive given to women in order to make them realize that they have to cover their faces. It was given as a temporary directive in certain situations in which the hypocrites were trying to mess with the personal lives of the wives of the Prophet. So basically, they were told when they go out for the call of nature to relieve themselves or for any other task, these hypocrites normally would follow them and they would create scandals and then come back and say, well, today I talked to the such and such wife of a prophet and I proposed to her and she said this and that. Of course, they would make this up. And when they would be told that, well, you are mistaken, my dear, this is not some orderly people. I mean, this is not someone that you think that is the wife of the prophet, and you should not actually say such things. Then they would make up this excuse, oh, I thought that I was actually talking to a slave girl. And that is how the Quran actually has narrated this whole affair in Surah Al-Azab, if you look it up. That basically, in order to make themselves distinct from slave women, as a precautionary measure and as a measure in which these hypocrites are not given any excuse, Muslim women were told, and the wives of the Prophet were told, that when they go out, they should just cover their heads in a way that part of their cloth would be left dangling over them. And this would make them distinct from slave women, and they would be known that they are decent women, and as a result, these hypocrites would not be afforded with any excuse of teasing them. So basically, this was a directive given in a certain environment in Medina when the hypocrites were after the personal lives of the Prophet. So when we will discuss Surah Al-Azab in our Quran class, and of course we have discussed this earlier on in certain other areas as well, that this is a whole scenario that had found its shape in Medina. This was the time when one of his wives, Aisha, she was blamed of adultery. The whole incident of it was something that took place in those times. So what had happened was that when these hypocrites and the Jews and the Christians, they saw that it was difficult to bring down the new religion through warfare or through other tactics. So one of the things that they adopted was to create mischief and mess with the private lives of the Prophet so that the common man would become disillusioned with their Prophet. So for this, they would play these pranks of teasing Muslim women and the wives of the Prophet. So in order to circumvent any such harassment, this was something that was conveyed. And this became a source of, some scholars thinking that, well, this is like a permanent directive given as a directive of something which guards the modesty of a woman, which of course is not the case, because when you study those verses, you say that they end on this phrase. It says, "Zalika yurafna, zalik adna and yurafna fala yuzan." that when they wear these big shawls on their faces, they'll be recognized as decent women, and they will not be harassed by these hypocrites. So if you look up some of the passages that I've just referred to, I think you'll find Ghamidi succeed on this, as well as some lectures on this that I have also given. You'll see how we try to explain that this verse has become misperception, a cause of misperception, that veil or face covering is at least something that is something recommended in Islam, whereas there is no such thing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem. Rosie, please go ahead.
Yeah, Assalamu alaikum. People who follow Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's tradition, like what he ate or how he dressed, they also say that we do it out of love for him. So what do you say about that?
We just discussed this, that I mean, love for him actually should be in the era or in the area in which he has brought religion for us. For example, love for him would be that we come closer to God. We pray the way we should pray, by focusing our attention. We should try to be affectionate to underprivileged people, kind to people who are in any sort of bother. So this is the love of the Prophet, that the directives that he brought down or were revealed to him, and as a result he gave them to us. We should follow them diligently. This would show our love for him. Because you see, following him in his personal capacity, had it been a virtue, had it been something of a recommended thing, the Quran would have been the first to tell us. And I've just referred to you to the words of the Prophet himself. So he said that وَإِذَا أَمَرْتُكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِّن رَأْيِي فَإِنَّمَا أَنَا بَشَرٌ. And إِذَا أَمَرْتُكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِّن دِينِكُمْ فَخُذُوهُ, which means that when I tell you something regarding religion, فَخُذُوا بِهِ, you can grasp it and follow it. And إِذَا أَمَرْتُكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِّن رَأْيِي فَإِنَّمَا أَنَا بَشَرٌ, when I say something to you out of my own personal opinion, that does not belong to religion, فَإِنَّمَا أَنَا بَشَرٌ, then I'm just a human being, and I can even make errors. So, I mean, that is something that we need to do. So the Prophet has clearly said that he is not someone who requires his followers to follow him in his personal capacity. And just to give you another recent example, that because the month of Ramadan has just recently passed, you often think that people would say that the Prophet would break his fast by eating a date. And without realizing that dates was a staple food of Arabia in those times. And when he broke his fast with dates, it was not because he was constituting or maybe instituting a sunnah. It was just that he was consuming something that was found in large quantities in Arabia. So remember, this is something that has to be at all costs understood. And that is the first principle also, that whatever you regard to the religion must have a religious status. I mean, eating or drinking does not have a religious status at all. So the very first principle of the sunnah is that whatever you regard to be a sunnah cannot be something of a worldly nature. It has to have the status of being something divinely ordained, or something that has a religious ring to it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem. While we await more questions, I would like to remind everyone that next Saturday is going to be another Ask Dr. Saleem session, where you can, it's just like what we're having right now, where you can bring your questions regarding Islam, Hadith, Quran in general, and we'll post them to Dr. Saleem. The Saturdays following, the first Saturday of the month, will either be Meezan lecture series or Islam study circles. During Islam study circle, we have a discussion segment where we have a topic that's given to us beforehand with the announcement for the weekend sessions. And then you can come to that session prepared to discuss and give us, your thoughts on the topic. And we also have Q&A during that time after the discussion segment. As for the Meezan, we're currently in that session, so you guys already know how Meezan goes. And now we have another question. So Bismillah, Ahmed, please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Saleem. So a quick question. As far as the prophets go, was it just Adam and Noah who were supposed to be the ancient prophets, and then after Moses, we know of everybody else? Is there any other prophet we know of that came, at that time, when Adam and Noah and the ancient time prophets? Do we know of anything like that, or we don't?
For example, ancient Arab nations of Ad and Samud, to whom were sent these prophets like Saleh and Hud, and we have the people of Madian to whom the prophet Shuaib was sent, and of course the prophet Al-Jasa, Zulkifli, all these prophets of God, they are named in the Quran. So you'll find that there are a couple of places in the Quran which give a comprehensive list of the prophets who have been enumerated in the Quran, and the Quran has said that the prophets were much more than the ones that it has pointed out, because the ones that it has pointed out are the ones which the Arabs knew, and because the book was addressing the Arabs and trying to make them realize that they have a history of prophets, so only those prophets were divulged to them who lived in around Arabia. Otherwise, there was a whole. We know that there were several prophets because the Quran says "Likulli ummatin rasul." It means that every single community was towards that community was sent a rasul, that was sent a messenger. Likulli ummatin rasul.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Saleem.
Thank you very much. Asim Awan, please go ahead.
Hey, Dr. Shehzad, just to piggyback off your point regarding food. So say somebody from other thought says, well, the Quran does actually prohibit certain foods. So if we were to engage with them in this discussion, would we just like, how exactly would we respond and say, well, the Quran speaks about food in terms of, would you say like purification, tazkiyah, or like how exactly would you address this objection?
So you see, we have already referred to this earlier on when we said that there are four areas of religion, four categories, in fact. So one of them, of course, is worship rituals themselves. The second one is anything that relates to the hygiene and purification of the body. The third one relates to the purification of the edibles or the dietary laws, and the fourth one is morals. So the food themselves, of course, they relate to religion because as far as religion is concerned, it tells us that whatever we eat is going to have an effect on our own nature. And plus, this is something that the Quran has regarded to be part of religion. So, inshallah, we'll take up the question in the Q&A session. I'm going to resume with the actual topic, which was the determinants of the Sunnah. So, we finished the first of these determinants, which actually summarizes to the fact that anything that has to be declared as Sunnah must be something that must be religious in nature, or something which the Quran regards to be religion. It has to be either something that is intrinsically religious in nature, or something which is regarded to be religion by the Quran. So the second principle, as far as the second principle is concerned, the text of this principle is something that I'm just going to read out. It says, the Sunnah entirely relates to practical affairs of life, belief, ideology, history, occasions of revelation, also called Sha'n Nuzul, and other similar things do not fall in its sphere. In the Arabic language, Sunnah means the trodden path. So the important thing that we have to first of all note as the second principle is that the Sunnah is something that entirely relates to practical affairs of life. Anything that is conceptual, ideological, cannot be termed as a Sunnah. So the way the Almighty dealt with peoples to whom messengers were sent by rewarding or punishing these people is called the Sunnatullah by the Quran. So the word Sunnah cannot be applied to things like faith, and nothing which relates to theoretical knowledge can be regarded as Sunnah. Its ambit is practical things, and everything that does not fall in this ambit cannot be Sunnah. So any directive which is conceptual in nature, anything that is not practical, that cannot be in any way regarded as a Sunnah. It has to relate. For example, Tawheed is not a Sunnah, or Risala is not a Sunnah, because these are concepts, these are ideologies, and ideologies are something that cannot be classified as Sunnah, because the word Sunnah actually means something that relates to practicality. So these are two principles that we have studied. Let's go on to the third principle. Now, the third principle is that even things which belong to the practical sphere cannot be regarded Sunnah if they are initiated by the Quran. It is known that the Prophet had amputated the hands of thieves, flogged criminals of adultery, stoned people to death for sexual misconduct, fought with people who deliberately denied the truth. However, all these acts cannot be termed as sunnah. All these directives are initiated by the Quran, and the Prophet merely followed them. So you see, the most important thing is that even in the practical sphere, if something is not originally initiated by the Sunnah, it cannot be regarded to be a Sunnah. If the Quran has initiated something practical, then that too cannot be regarded as Sunnah. And as Ustaz has given this example, that cutting off the hands of thieves, of course, is something of a practical thing. But it cannot be regarded as a Sunnah because the Quran has initiated this thing. It has been mentioned for the first time in the Quran. So anything which is initiated by the Quran and not by the practical example of the Prophet also cannot be termed as the Sunnah. So all these are directives initiated by the Quran, and the Prophet merely followed them. I mean, these, for example, if he amputated the hands of criminals, or he flogged certain criminals for adultery, or stoned them for sexual misconduct, all these are practical things, but the Prophet is now only following the Quran. But on the other hand, directives such as the prayer, the fast, zakat, hajj, animal sacrifice, they are also mentioned in the Quran, and it has also made some corrections in them. But it becomes evident from the Quran itself that these directives were primarily initiated by Prophet Muhammad himself once he had revived them as part of Abraham's religion and given them religious sanction. So the zakat, of course, or the hajj, or the prayer itself is something that was not initiated by the Quran. It was something that was actually initiated, or in fact revived, by Prophet Muhammad once he revived the practices of Prophet Abraham. So if something is originally based on the Quran and the Prophet has merely explained it or followed it in exactly the same way he was directed to, then these words or acts of the Prophet cannot be called the Sunnah. They will be termed as the Prophet's explanation and exemplary manner in which he acted upon them. Only those things will be regarded as Sunnah which are originally based on the words, practices, or tacit approvals of Prophet Muhammad, and they cannot be regarded as following a directive of the Quran or an explanation of a directive mentioned in it. So again, something that is very, very important, that things which have not been initiated by the Prophet but are of a practical nature and have been initiated by the Quran, in that case, when the Prophet actually follows them, all that he is doing is he's not initiating them. He is just following the initiation of the Quran. He's just following what the Quran has asked him to follow, and thus they cannot also be called the Sunnah. So now we come to the fourth principle. This fourth principle says a new Sunnah is not constituted by merely observing some Sunnah in an optional manner. We know that the Prophet, while obeying the Quranic directive, وَمَنْ تَتَوَّى خَيْرًا فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ شَاكِرٌ عَلِيمٌ, which means he who does the virtue of his own will, God accepts it as all-knowing. God accepts it and is all-knowing. Offered optional prayers besides the obligatory ones, fasted optionally besides the obligatory fasts of Ramadan, offered animal sacrifice at instances in which it was not obligatory. However, none of these optional acts of worship constitute a new Sunnah. The way the Prophet showed diligence in worshipping over and above what was required of him can definitely be termed as a good example that he set for his followers. However, it cannot be regarded as an independent Sunnah. It cannot be regarded as an independent Sunnah. So again, something which the Prophet has done in an optional way, something that has already been instituted, then it will not be called a new Sunnah. For example, if the Prophet offers some prayers, like we know that he offered the Ishraq prayer, or he offered the Chasht prayer, which at times are the same, or for example, the fast that he kept on Mondays and Thursdays, they will not constitute a new Sunnah, because fasting and praying is already a Sunnah. And when the Prophet actually follows this Sunnah and follows it on some other occasions, then that too will not in any way constitute a new Sunnah. So that is something that we have to also understand. And similar is the case of doing some deed of religion in its most ultimate and perfect form. So, for example, the Prophet did ablution, or he did wuzu and ghusl, and they are very good examples that can be presented in this regard. The way the Prophet went about doing these does not constitute any independent original deed that may be regarded as another sunnah. He has in fact tried to obey an original sunnah in its most complete and perfect form. So they shall be regarded as exemplary forms in which he acted upon a sunnah, and not regarded as an independent sunan. So if the Prophet, for example, he bathed and did ablution in a very perfect way, so that would be his exemplar of following a sunnah. It will not constitute a new sunnah. So that again is something which is very important and which Ustaz Ghamidi has pointed out. We now come to the fifth principle that he has enumerated. He says things which merely state some aspects of human nature cannot be regarded as sunnah except if the prophets of God have made any of them an essential part of religion. Then he gives examples that beasts having canine teeth and birds having claws have been prohibited by the Prophet. However, this prohibition is only a delineation of human nature, and hence this prohibition, it cannot be termed as a sunnah. So the thing that we have to understand is that whenever the Prophet is talking about certain aspects of human nature and he points out certain directives that relate to human nature, what he's doing is he's just explaining that human nature, and he's not constituting or instituting a new sunnah. For example, if he says that beasts having canine teeth or birds having claws are prohibited, it is not something that he has done so as a new directive or as a sunnah. All that he is doing is he's telling us that this is how human nature is. Human nature will never eat animals which are predators, which are carnivorous in this sense. So if he has said that animals which have canine teeth or birds which have claws should not be eaten, this will not be constituting a new sunnah. It's only a delineation of human nature, because the Prophet is also someone who delineates human nature. So the important thing is that as far as the Quran is concerned, the foods which it has prohibited, for example, we know that there are certain types of food it has prohibited. This is merely a delineation of human nature. So human beings, they inherently know that lions and tigers and elephants are not meant to be eaten. They are well aware of the fact that horses and mules are a means of transportation and have no role in satisfying one's hunger. And there are some other similar things also which have been mentioned in various narratives, and thus should not be considered as independent sunan. They are not independent sunan. They are just a delineation of human nature. Now we come to the sixth principle. The sixth principle says, those guidelines of the Prophet also cannot be regarded as sunnah, the nature of which is totally sufficient to show that the Prophet never wanted to constitute them as sunnah. One example of this is the utterances and supplications which are said in the qarda. So qarda is the posture that we have in the prayer while one is sitting down. It is evident from various narratives that the Prophet taught the tashahhud and the durood to be recited in the qarda. However, it is also clear from these narratives that neither did the Prophet himself prescribe these supplications for this occasion, nor after teaching them did he make them mandatory upon people to read them. So when he's teaching something, it does not mean that at all times he's teaching a new sunnah. At times, when he's teaching something, he's recommending something. The nature of that recommendation is that he is giving us a choice to do it or not to do it. And as you can see, that example that he has given is the one that we come across almost in every prayer when we have to utter the durood maybe, or some supplication. So these are just recommendations made by the Prophet that, well, yes, when you're sitting in the qarda, you can actually say these words, or you can adhere to these utterances. And in other words, the only thing that is sunnah in this regard is that one must sit in the qarda position, the sitting position. That is all that is sunnah. As far as what is to be read in that qarda is concerned, that is not sunnah, because the Prophet never constituted it. It left to our own discretion. So other than this, no other thing can be regarded sunnah in this affair. Now we come to the seventh and the last principle. So the seventh and the last principle says, just as the Quran is not validated through Khabar Wahid, the Sunnah is also not validated through it. The Sunnah is an independent source of religion. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was liable to communicate it with great care and diligence in its original form and in a manner that would render it certain. It was not left to a person's choice to communicate it further, as is the case of Khabar Wahid. Consequently, the source of the Sunnah is the consensus of this Ummah, just as the source of the Quran is the consensus of the Ummah. Just as the Quran has been transmitted to the Ummah by the consensus and verbal perpetuation of the companions of the Prophet, the Sunnah is transmitted to the Ummah by their consensus and their practical perpetuation. Less than this extent of validation, the Quran and Sunnah cannot be accepted. Only the ahadith which depict the exemplary personality of the Prophet or which contain his explication are transmitted through lesser means of validation. So this seventh and last point makes it absolutely clear that the Sunnah has been transmitted in exactly the same mode as the Quran is, rendering both of them certain. So the Quran was transmitted from one generation to another generation in its verbal form, and the Sunnah was transmitted from one generation to another generation in its practical form. It was not transmitted from a couple of people to a couple of people, and so on and so forth. A whole generation transmitted that Sunnah or that practical directive to the next generation by its adherence to that practice. And at the same time, as far as consensus were concerned, every single companion in the first generation of the Prophet, of course, vouched for the fact that this is a Sunnah. So the Sunnah was transmitted in this way, that as far as the practical perpetuation of the Ummah was concerned, every single person, all people of that generation, they literally practiced it, and that practice was transferred to the next generation. So it was not a khabar wahid sort of a thing in which one or a couple of people transmit a piece of news to other people. No, this was the generation adhering to a certain predictive. For example, look at the prayer. So the whole generation of the Prophet's companions, they adhere to the prayer. They transmitted those 5 prayers and to the next generation, and then that next generation, they stuck to this whole practical example, and then they transferred it by this practical perpetuation to the next generation. And ever since then, we have so many generations, and each of these generations has given us or transmitted us in this manner. So this brings us to an end to Ustaz Ghamidi's concept of the determinants of the Sunnah. These are the 7 very important principles regarding the determination of the Sunnah. And these 7 principles, of course, if what has been transmitted to the Ummah by the Prophet other than the Quran is deliberated upon in the light of these principles, Ustaz Ghamidi says that the Sunnah, like the Quran, can be determined with absolute certainty. So that just as we have the Quran, the corpus of the Quran, the text of the Quran, absolutely determined that this is what constitutes the text of the Quran. In a similar way, he says that if these 7 principles are applied, then we get a list of the Sunnah that is to be adhered to, and that is a list, of course, that we had, of course, gone through very earlier on when we were studying the sources of religion. And so this brings us to an end to today's discussion regarding the principles of determining the Sunnah. If you have any questions, we will inshallah tackle them. And in our next session, when it takes place, we'll now going to study the principles of understanding Hadith. So that would be our third topic when we take up the Meezan lecture series the next time. So now, if you have any questions, please raise them.
Thank you very much. I'd like to remind everyone to please stay on topic because we're short on time. But there was one question that was cut off while we were transitioning between the to the Meezan lecture. So Hashim Qazi, if you don't mind, could you please repeat your question? And that'll be the only off-topic question during this.
Yeah. Okay. Quickly. Just wanted to ask: is there any recommended book which talks about roles and responsibilities of husband and wife?
Yeah.
Beside Quran. Thank you.
So, I mean, there are books like, for example, One is written by Dipti Nazir Ahmed. It's called Al Haqooq wal Faraiz. I mean, it's basically a book in Urdu, but I think you might find it in the English language also. It's by Maulvi Nazir Ahmed. Then we have another book by Ustaz Abul Ala Maududi. It's called Hukuk Zawjain, which means the rights of the spouses. It has been translated into English as well. You might find it. And then we have a book by, I mean, in fact, it's a chapter of a book that has been published separately. It's called The Social Sharia by Ustaz Javed Ahmed Ghamidi. So in that chapter, he has discussed the rights and obligations of the spouses. So these are the three things that come to my mind off the top of my head. Otherwise, of course, our ummah has been rich in this tradition. And if you just maybe Google, or a better way would be to ask ChatGPT, it will give you a whole list of works in the English language or the language that you are comfortable with. Another very serious source is Google Scholar. So I'm sure you must be aware of it. It's a scholarly version of Google. It's called Google Scholar. If you just write the topic, you get all the literature on that topic that has been maybe authored in the last decades.
Thank you very much. Asim Awan, please go ahead.
This is Dr. Shehzad. So, would it be accurate to say, just like a general rule for us individual Muslims in this determination of Sunnah? So, example, the differences of opinion in prayer, for example, like raising the hands or raising fingers, since these are differences of opinion, we can automatically say, just by default, saying that these aren't Sunnahs. What are Sunnahs is maybe differences of opinion. They aren't really an issue that applies to the validity of prayer.
Yeah. So partly this is true, but partly there is another truth that has to be understood, and that is that there are portions of the prayer that were left to the discretion of the person who prays. For example, tying the hands, whether to tie them at all or to just leave them dangling by the side. So that is something that was left to the individual. So now we see that there are people who insist on tying the hands, and there are other people who don't tie their hands, and one tries to, differ with the other and says that you are wrong. So you'll realize that on most occasions these differences are not differences; they are basically instances in which the Prophet gave us discretion to exercise, and ultimately what happened was that one group became adamant on one of the possibilities, and another group became adamant on another possibility and regarded each other to be incorrect. So the correct stature and the correct version here is that in most such cases, you'll find that it was the leverage that the Prophet himself gave, that, well, it's up to you whether you do this or you do that, and which ultimately became or crystallized in the form of very severe differences of opinion.
So just to piggyback off that, can we say it's actually not allowed, or not actually even say not allowed by Islam to even fight over these type of issues?
Of course. Yes, that's correct. These are issues in which we were given our own discretion to exercise. So I was given this discretion. I can tie my hands. I can let them remain untied. I can raise my hands whenever I say Allahu Akbar, which is called Raful Yadain. And it's to me that I might not do so. But of course, raising my hands when I start the prayer was made mandatory. But rest of the Raful Yadain that of course takes place during the prayer also, that was left to our option. So we find that one of the sects, they insisted that the Raful Yadain has to be is a compulsory every time we pronounce it, and there are others who say no, it's only compulsory for the start of the prayer. So again, this is a very typical example that Raful Yadain itself, except for the start of the prayer, was a choice that was given to us. If we want, we could have raised our hands whenever we say Allahu Akbar. Or if you want, we were given the option of not doing so. So, as I said, more often than not, the case is of discretion given to us and wrongly misperceived or perceived, I would say, as if the Prophet was either insisting on one and proscribing the other.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem. Salman Aziz, please go ahead.
So you just gave the example of Rafi Adan and said that it's left to our discretion. So could you please gives example of something that is not left to our discretion, that is completely in contrast with it.
For example, Surah Fatiha had to be read in every prayer. This is something that there is a consensus. For example, we have to read part of the Quran after Surah Fatiha. There is a consensus of that. Similarly, we know that whenever we get up from our kneeling position, we have to say Sami Allahu liman hamida. That was again something of an obligation. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. What was instituted was that you have to say it once. Whether you say it twice or not, that was left to you. So we know that there are people who just look on one side and say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah and they finish the prayer. That was all that was required. But of course, because of the option given to us that it could have been done on both sides. So now we find certain people doing it just on the right side and abandoning the left one, and others who do it on both sides. Whereas the actual matter was that again, this was a discretion given to us. So you see, it's just a question of not understanding that discretion that has caused so much commotion in our various approaches.
Thank you very much. Rosie, please go ahead.
Yeah, Assalamu alaikum. I just want to make sure that I understood it right. You said that the Sunnah is what the entire generation practiced and then next generation followed, and that's how it has reached us. So does that mean that the traditions that have come to us through like a chain of narration are not considered Sunnah? And if
They are not.
that's the
Yes, of
case,
course. Yes,
were
so
the
they are
works
called
of
hadith. They have to be regarded as distinct from the Sunnah. So you see, Sunnah is something that has been transmitted by a whole generation to another generation. Hadith means they actually refer to narrations that have been transferred from a couple of people to the next couple of people, and so on and so forth. And this is a distinction that has to be made. But loosely, today, when you study religion, you'll find Sunnah and Hadith being used interchangeably and causing this confusion. So it is because of this confusion that you might have encountered when you're studying religion that might have been the cause of the question that you have in mind. Otherwise, as far as religion is concerned, it has made these categories distinct. So Sunnah is something different from the Hadith. But normally people today, they just use them synonymously, which is incorrect.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem. Rosie, did you have a follow-up question?
no, I'm just wondering, aren't the two the same things? Like Hadith is if that's how we know it. That's
Yes.
how the Sunnah we
This
know
is
it
something
because
that, you might need to unlearn because ever since our childhood, this is how we have been taught religion, that no distinction has been made between Sunnah and Hadith, and they are used interchangeably as practices of the Prophet without realizing that actually one of them is a definitive thing, something that has the same certainty as the Quran. And the other, of course, which is Hadith, is something that has to be judged. Its authenticity is always subject to historical criticism, and that is something that inshallah we'll be taking up in our future sessions. So the two are different, and our past authorities also have made this distinction. The only thing is that they would say that a sunnah tanqasimu qismain. They would say that the sunnah is of two types. So to them, they would say there is one type of sunnah that is transmitted through tawatur, and another type of sunnah which is transmitted through one few people to another people. So they would use the word sunnah for hadith also. So this is an ongoing, I would say, confusion ever since so many centuries. So it is basically in this era when Ustaz Ghamidi has ventured forth to give this opinion that because this sunnah is of two types, one which is like generation to generation transferred, and the other which is transferred from one person to another, or a couple of person to a couple of person. So because the nature is fundamentally different, so it is inappropriate to call both of them as Sunnah or Hadith. They must be given separate names. So he's ventured forth, and before him, his own teacher, Ustaz Amin and Islahi, has also given a similar view that the Sunnah must not be confused with the Hadith. Both are distinct from one another, and it is by not making this distinction that we have ended up considering a lot of questionable things which are found in Hadith to be things which are Sunnah. So, for example, there are narratives which are questionable. There are narratives which have to be critically evaluated because of the fact that their narration is dubious in nature, and that has given rise to people who have negated or maybe criticized certain hadiths, and then being called as people who, for example, are rejectors of the Sunnah. Whereas this is not the case. Sunnah is something which is as I mean, as certain as the Quran itself is, as far as the corpus is concerned. Like, for example, the prayer is a beautiful example. The fast is another example. So all these worship rituals, these are sunnahs, which means that they have been transmitted from one generation to another. They are not ahadith. They cannot be classified as ahadith. Ahadith, for example, is like an explanation that at times the Prophet gave when he was asked. At times it's a situational comment that he made when he was passing by maybe some incident. So they were all incidental. So every single hadith is incidental, which means that it is occasioned by a certain background. There is something to it as a result of which the Prophet speaks of something. Whereas the Sunnah is like a practical thing which he has ordained for us to follow, and every single person of his generation, he actually adhered to it and then transferred it to the next generation.
Salman Aziz, please go ahead.
So you said that Sunnah is as important or certain as Quran. But for Quran, we see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has vowed to safeguard it, but Sunnah is left to the perception of everyone. Could you please explain this?
I mean, this is something which God has left to our own discretion. He could have probably made the same, he could have adopted the same methodology as the Quran. He could have said that, well, these are the sunnahs. And just as the Quran, we know, is something of a text that he gave us, and it is a definitive text. He could have done the same thing with the sunnah, but he chose not to do it. So, I mean, the choice was his. So instead of giving us a definitive corpus of the sunnah, he chose to say or tell us that, well, this is something that predates the Quran. Remember, the sunnah was not something that was instituted by the Prophet himself. It was something that he actually inherited from Prophet Abraham. So there were certain things that needed to be either deleted or added or revived. So all that he did was he either added something or deleted something or maybe revived something. So it is something that previous prophets were already doing before him. As I said, this is something, if you look, for example, if you read Al-Fawz al-Kabir of Shah Waliullah, which is a book that every advanced learner can read, it's a very short book. He'll give you this list of sunnahs. I mean, these lists of practical things which the Millat Ibrahimi or the religion of Abraham actually stood for. And you'll see that they are, I mean, almost all of them are the same as the ones that you'll find as being enumerated in the list of sunnahs which Ustaz Ghamidi has compiled, barring a few. So I think it was left to the discretion of the Prophet himself. Instead of he actually enumerating that these are the sunnah that he inherited from Prophet Abraham, he did not choose to do so. All that he did was that he just stuck to them, thinking that the people should not come under any confusion. But yes, the confusion did arise later on, and a lot of things got mixed up. But and then, of course, this is something that we can only think that the choice that the Prophet made must have had some wisdom. And that wisdom, of course, could be one thing that I can point out. You can point out another thing. But the fact is that this is a historical reality, that neither God himself nor the Prophet chose to enlist the sunnahs, as is the case with the Quran.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem. Asim Hawan, please go ahead.
So is it accurate to say, Dr. Shehzad, so when we talk about your use of, when we're using the terminology hadith, it's not the documentation of it, it's the isnad that this person said this thing to this person to said this
Correct.
thing. The documentation, documentary evidence is going to exist for sunnah or hadith irrespective. It's just the fact
Irrespective.
that
Correct.
Okay.
That's absolutely correct, because that documentary evidence is going to exist, and it came into being much later on. Otherwise, originally our hadiths were also transmitted orally. But again, that was from one or couple of persons to a couple of persons, until the time, like, for example, people like Imam Ahmed bin Hanbal, or even before him, Imam Malik, they started to write down.
So just to piggyback off that, what's the difference between sunnah and the terminology of ijma? Because sometimes scholars use ijma like consensus of Muslims, but
So ijma is the methodology of the sunnah. So ijma means that you transmit something from practical consensus. So or I mean, people being united on a particular thing. So in the same sense, you'll find that the sunnah is something upon which there was a consensus that whatever the Prophet is transferring as sunnah, there is a consensus of that. So consensus and sunnah, they can be understood in a way that consensus always exists conceptually. and Sunnah always exists practically. So when I say there is a consensus on this, on such and such a concept, it will always be a concept. It will be a piece of knowledge that I have. Whereas Sunnah will be, of course, a practical directive that has been given to us. So it's one is a concept, and the other one is a practical directive of religion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem. That was it for all the questions today. Inshallah, see you tomorrow in another session of textual study of the Quran. Thanks a lot to all the participants for coming through and asking great questions and bearing with us during the technical issues. Inshallah, we'll see you all tomorrow. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.